We have just a couple things to finish up in 2 Samuel 12, and then we're mainly going to look in 13. Let's see where we are. Okay, so we've been talking about David and Bathsheba and the great sin there, and all the times that David was able to kind of change his course of action, but did not. He really persisted in that sin all the way until it was exposed by the prophet Nathan, who does give him, first what ends up being a little parable, and then a very pointed accusation telling him that he has sinned against God. David, to his credit, does not make any more excuses after that. He simply says, I have sinned against the Lord. The simplest two-word, in Hebrew, two-word way of showing his guilt. And he owns up to it entirely. And so what we ended with last week was talking about contrasting David's response with Saul's response from 1 Samuel 15 when Saul was confronted. Saul continued the excuses again and again while David owned up to it. And so there was a difference in God's response as well, where God's response to Saul was to take the kingdom from him, to say that you're not going to, the kingdom's not going to be passed down to your son, and you're not going to continue to let this reign in your house. For generations going forward, I'll give this to someone else. While with David, God pardons him and says, because of your repentance, you will not die. And we note here that David had committed 2 capital offenses under the law by this point, adultery and murder. And especially as someone in a high position of power, this is a pretty scandalous thing that has happened. And so God says, you will not die, but the child will still die. And we didn't really get to talk about that any more than that last week, but note that's verse 14, where it says, nevertheless, because by this deed you have utterly scorned the Lord, the child who is born to you shall die. And that's the end of the conversation, because Nathan leaves. So my question for you, because these are the kinds of things that people ask, is why does God insist on killing this child that's being born to Bathsheba? Is David forgiven or not? Yeah, Gary? Okay, so we know it's a scandalous thing that has happened. It's not good for the name of the Lord. It gives opportunity for the enemies of God to use this to their advantage and to denigrate the name of God and the name of David as well. But isn't David forgiven? Like, I thought you were forgiven. Like, that's that. Gary? That's right. There are consequences to sin. Go ahead, Steve.
David didn't get struck dead.
Yeah, David wasn't struck dead. That was really what the consequence should be for him. There's already been mercy extended to him by not killing David and not making him face the harshest penalty that he could have. Karen, were you raising your hand? Yeah. Okay. So it's part of life, and there are consequences. That being said, hey, a lot of people are not okay with this. A lot of people use this, whether we're reading something like it in, here in 2 Samuel 12, and saying, well, God shouldn't have done that, or in the situations that they are in, they don't want to deal with any consequences when they have sinned or when they've done something that is wrong, especially when they've tried to own up to it. Dad? Yeah.
The other part is, it says that there must more to the physical temporal life of the child. They give us an example of the eternal life that each soul has, whereas the physical life of the child was snuffed out in the third of the night bed, and he knows all the child. The eternal life of the soul is programmed to the
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So that's a good point to bring up here as well, that there's an eternal life still for this child. We're very focused on that physical life there and on what is being snuffed out, that we see, hey, there's a whole life that's being taken away from this child, but from God's point of view, that child is being brought to him and is going on to the eternal life. Jeff? Yeah.
We look at it as this life is what it's worth, and if they miss out on this life, then that is a big miss. But no, they're gone on to heaven, the David will say something different. That that is far greater than growing up here.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Sorry, who was it? Yeah, I think it is. And, we are so focused on this life. It is what we can see around us. It is what we have experienced at this time, that we see that this child has had everything taken from him, from our perspective. But that's not really the case there. Mark? Yeah. Okay, so there is a shadow there as well of a son dying as a consequence for sin. An innocent son there who did not do anything wrong himself. And let's be clear about that. There's no sin on the child's part there. I think that is important for us to note, because in cases of adultery and fornication that we see today, sometimes people really do hold it against the child. And part of that thing that Jeff was talking about, of God maybe sparing that child from, it shouldn't be that way, that people would treat someone like that. But there's a difference between shouldn't and is. A lot of times, even today, people have a certain suspicion and dishonor that they put upon a person like that. Mark.
I think that extends to other arguments when we talk about God running genocide, and people want to criticize God for having children killed. Those souls belong to God. They belong to God. Because they belong to Him, just like we.
Yeah. So why is it, let's get a little philosophical here, right? Why is it wrong for us to kill, for us to murder? Jeff? We're not the judge. It's not our life to take. It's, yeah. Yeah. There's a sacredness to life that we're not permitted to take. And then in the cases where, okay, we have governmental authority that is given the right to use the sword and to take life, that's still a very sober thing, and God puts a lot of responsibility upon those in power to use that well, and they're held responsible for when they don't. But we cannot go around just taking life willy-nilly because it's not ours to take. Well, the same doesn't apply to God. God gave the life, and God can take the life, and that is not sin for God to do. And in fact, we say, and it's something I say as well, we talk about people, being, killed before their time or dying prematurely, and we know in what sense we mean that. In the strictest sense, that's not true. In the strictest sense, there's no such thing as a person who dies before their time, because we're not guaranteed anything. That would really only be true if, God had a contract with us saying, hey, I will give you 89 years of life, or I will give you 42 years of life, or I will give you 117 years of life, and then we could be robbed of that. But God has not promised us anything. We have what life we are given, and then we go on to the afterlife. So, yes, this child has died. No, it's not because the child did anything wrong or was guilty of any sin, or the child himself was something that God hated. Nothing like that. The reasoning given here is that by this sin that David committed, he had utterly scorned the Lord. And yes, David has repented. Yes, he is forgiven by God. But there's still opportunity for the enemies of the Lord to speak terrible things about God. And so there needs to be a consequence. This is essentially the same argument that God will use later for why Judah and Israel are taken into captivity. Why does God let it go that far? Why does God bring such a terrible punishment upon them? Because they've utterly scorned the name of the Lord, and his name must be glorified. Gary. So, yeah, God says it both ways. So, first it happens with the different nations for different reasons. God identifies that they are rebelling against him and that they are committing great sin, and he's bringing a time for judgment for all of these nations. But very frequently he uses one nation to judge another. And so Assyria comes in and they conquer Israel and take Israel into captivity. That's Israel's judgment. Well, Assyria is due for judgment as well. It's just coming a little bit later. And the instrument that God uses to judge Assyria is Babylon. Well, when Babylon comes to do that, they judge both Assyria and still Israel again in captivity. But then also Judah. And now it's Judah's time for punishment. But that doesn't mean that Babylon is such a paragon of virtue or anything like that, because Babylon gets their time of judgment a little while later. God judges all of the nations of the world in their time, and the fact that he uses another nation to do so doesn't mean that he is validating everything that nation is doing. Basically, we're summarizing the book of Habakkuk at this point, because that's the question that Habakkuk had when God told him that Babylon was going to come and judge Judah. Habakkuk does not understand why, and he says, why them? Aren't they even more evil than we are? And God says, this is the way that I am going to do things. Dan. Okay, yeah, so let's talk about David's grief. We haven't hit that yet. So David's grief while his son is sick. So God does not immediately strike the son dead. He instead falls sick, and David's response there is very extreme. So he is fasting. He lays all night on the ground, appealing to God for 7 days. He's totally inconsolable. And other people are trying to console him. The elders of his house are doing that. Other people are very concerned for him. And I guess before we get to exactly what happened, to Diane's question there, is this a good example for us of fasting in a situation like this? What do y'all think? I think it is. So fasting has kind of been removed as a cultural practice for us in a way that we don't think about it like they did. But very commonly in Scripture, we see fasting being used for a variety of purposes. We see it in times of great grief, although, hey, there are still some times that we are overwhelmed by grief and you don't really feel like eating a pizza right then. And so you do skip some meals, and you might not call that a fast, but it's out of the grief that I'm not eating, I'm not sleeping, I'm not doing anything but experiencing this grief. So, hey, let's not say that it doesn't happen at all today. But there are also more like deliberate fasts that happen, particularly in the Old Testament, but in the New Testament as well. In times of grief, to show that sorrow and to make that appeal to God. We see fasts in times of a difficult decision that needs to be made, where we're going to try to strip away the things of this world and strip away all the distractions that I am facing, to center myself, to spend time in prayer to God. We see fasting used more generically as a time to be more spiritually focused, to spend more time in prayer, more time in worship. There's a lot of things like that in the Bible that, we are never commanded in the New Testament to fast with any particular frequency or for any one purpose. But it's not necessarily a bad idea. And we see a lot of benefits that they gain from it that might be a good thing for us to consider as well. Mark?
Yeah, strictly from the scientific research of things I've read, the beginning parts of fasting, your body starts to regenerate things. You get a clarity of mind, and it heightens your ability to meditate, pray, and do these things, focus on it. Now, you extend the fast much longer than that kind of diminishes. Now you're like what David was doing, showing grief. Said, I'm in no position to nourish myself. I don't want to be grief. But those are in the scientific realm. We've been doing studies and we've found that what people have been practicing for a very long time is really very good for them, very
Yeah. Yeah, we've seen scientific research come out talking about how that can be beneficial. Again, fasting can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. The Pharisees in the New Testament, I believe it was twice a week that they fasted, so they had 2 days that they chose not to eat. Of course, we know that they were doing it with the purpose of showing people how moral and how righteous they were. Look at how disciplined I am that I can restrict myself in this way. Don't do that. That's not the right attitude at all with fasting or with anything else that you do for God. It's not about putting on a show for people. What David is doing here, I think, is extreme grief. I don't know that he went into this thinking, I'm going to fast for 7 days and make this as a special appeal to God. I think he is overwhelmed with grief here and cannot think of doing anything else other than being paralyzed in fear and appealing to God. Jeff?
I don't see David's attitude here being like, God, I don't care what you say, I want him to live, I want him to
Yeah.
live. I see David more, okay, God, could you change his mind?
Yeah.
But if you don't, your will be done. I don't know if that's the thing.
Yeah.
Some people would hold it against God, but I don't see David doing that.
No, David's not holding it against God. And particularly with how this plays out, I agree with your assessment there that David is really doing the only thing he can do, and he's doing it in a faithful way. That he is hoping that God will change his mind, and God is a merciful God, and does change his mind many times for us to spare us and to show us mercy and to withhold that punishment. And appealing to God in that way can have results. Moses appealed to God and said, don't destroy the people. And God listened, and God didn't do it. So David's not crazy for trying. Go ahead, Jeff. Yeah. So that's another example there. So there's nothing wrong with asking. There's nothing wrong with appealing to God, provided that it's done with the right attitude, that it's God's will that really needs to be done, and it's what is good for the name of the Lord. So we see David, paralyzed in fear, bowing before the Lord, 7 days, not doing anything. He's not eating. He's not talking with people. He's not going about his business. Hey, the country's still moving forward with all the things that are happening in the nation. None of that matters right now. David is totally focused on this and overcome with grief. And on the 7th day, the child died. And all David's servants are very nervous to tell him. Why are they nervous to tell him? Yeah, he doesn't look like he's in a real stable spot right now. This could be enough to push him over the edge, and David might harm himself. David might kill himself, even, just out of the sheer grief of the occasion. And so nobody wants to be the one to go up and tell him. Plus, that doesn't sound like a very fun conversation anyway. Steve? Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm. Absalom, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, David has some, in some ways, unpredictable reactions to some of these things. That he's got a wider perspective that helps him to see this a little differently than people often expect. Gary? Yes. Yeah, absolutely. The guilt makes it so much worse. Losing a child is awful and something no one wants to go through. Losing a child and it being your fault is infinitely worse. And so David has intense grief over this. But, thankfully no one has to come and tell him. David figures out that the child has died because he sees them all whispering to themselves and infers what's going on. And so what then does David do once he knows the child is dead? Jeff? Yeah. Which is an odd reaction in some ways. David cleans up, eats, goes about his business. You would think that would be the most intense moment of grief, yet it doesn't really seem to be that way. And how does David explain this? Because they are surprised by this when they see that. Excuse me? You can't change the past. There's nothing to do about it now. Yeah.
Sunday morning she had, I'm in church. Never, actually asked that he come to worship. And I mean, I don't believe they were Christian, and some of the members at the church. And it was stable support, something to do that.
Yeah. Yeah. Because that's what David says here. His first thing was, while the child was still alive, I fasted and wept, for I said, who knows whether the Lord will be gracious to me that the child may live? But now he is dead. Why should I fast? Can I bring him back again? I shall go to him, but he will not return to me. And yeah, those words, the ending words there are sad and comforting at the same time. Like, they're hard to read. You can see David's grief there, but also that David has faith that there's something beyond this life, that he will see his son again, not here. His son's not going to come back, but in the future, in the resurrection, he will see his son. Mark?
Yeah, I know there's a lot of questions on whether the Israelites of old believed in the afterlife, and there it is right there. I'm going to go to him. He can't come back here.
Yeah. Now, I think we can, say or somewhat assume that their understanding of the afterlife was incomplete a little, although, I'd say our understanding of the afterlife is probably incomplete and a little half-formed, so don't take it as a dig against the Israelites. They might not have known everything, but hey, men and women of faith believed that there was something beyond this life. And whatever they knew about it, because the Old Testament doesn't talk a lot about it. Really, the things we see are more protection in this life and blessing in this life, and they have to make a bit of a leap to see that there's something beyond it. Yet David and others do understand there's something more.
Well, I think they might have understood to some extent, because when God says, things, he says, like, I am the God of Abraham.
Yeah.
I am the God, not I was.
Yeah.
Abraham's God, or I was, I am. He says, I am.
Yeah.
All these descendants, past descendants, I am still their God.
Yeah, and Jesus brought up that very passage and used that to condemn the Sadducees, to say, you ought to know better. You ought to know that there is a resurrection based off of that passage, which I'm always a little bit impressed with, because that is not the most direct way that you could understand that passage, yet Jesus expected them to be able to do so. I think the answer here is that men and women of faith knew that there was something, and it was something good and about being with God. But there's a lot of complicated emotions happening here for David, that he still feels the grief. We know the grief has not gone away, even though he's cleaned himself up, even though he has eaten food and he's going about his business. The grief doesn't disappear, in a flash or anything. There is still sorrow, and probably sorrow that he will hold on to for the rest of his life, particularly because there is guilt associated with that sorrow. This is not just the generic sorrow of a bad thing happened to me, but also that I caused this to happen. But also, let's not jump over the fact that the reason why David was fasting and weeping and appealing to God was not just an overflow of sorrow, but also appealing to God for mercy. And he explicitly says that here. Who knows whether the Lord will be gracious to me that the child may live. David asks for mercy. David asks for that child to be spared and hopes that God will grant him his request. And there's no sin in David doing that. Not with this attitude, at least. He makes the attempt, he makes the appeal to God, and he is very, very firm and resolute in that. But then, once the child is dead, David's new reaction is, okay, God has denied me this mercy. That's not God's fault, and God is not to blame here. What's done is done. Now it's time to move on. He accepts the judgment of the Lord and knows that this is the price for his guilt. And say what you will about David, but he tends to be good at this, at accepting the punishment for when he has messed up or when he has sinned. He's done more than mess up here. He's sinned pretty grievously, but he is willing to accept God's judgment in the matter. Steve?
Your point there is that Jesus speaking magnitude, and it's not only on the subject, but that's where they all kind of, that's what Jesus is showing. He was before Abraham, and David, and all that, and God is not a God where God is over.
Mm-hmm. No, it's a neat application there, and one that showed that they were supposed to see this, and that they were supposed to understand that there was a life to come, and that death is not the end, as much as it looks like the end to us. Yeah. Let's also take a moment to appreciate the fact that even though David is king, and David has a lot of people whose job it is to do what he says, whose job it is to make his life easier and to tell him yes, David has not lost his sense of humility and his ability to submit himself to God. Yes, he has sinned terribly in this chapter, but even though he is king, he is not on top of the world and believes that everybody is under him. He knows that God is still ultimately in control, and God is just as much his God now as he was when he was just a shepherd boy. And that's a good lesson for us. We get big for our britches sometimes as we advance in life, as we get into a better position or have more money or have more respect that is given to us. However small that might be, it's very easy for that to go to our heads and to think that now we're really something. But God will always be our God, and our duties to each other will always be to show love and to show the self-sacrificing spirit to each other. Anything else through there? Okay, so then a little time goes by. Verses 24 and 25 says, Then David comforted his wife Bathsheba and went in to her and lay with her, and she bore a son, and he called his name Solomon. And the Lord loved him and sent a message by Nathan the prophet. So he called his name Jedediah because of the Lord. This is more than just a note about the birth of Solomon. Of course, Solomon's going to become very important. He's going to be the next king over Israel, and so we'll be talking much more about Solomon. And sometimes when we have a figure that's going to be discussed more in the future, we get a special note showing their birth or showing something about them early on, just to kind of put a time marker in there. This is more than a time marker and more than a way of showing who Solomon's mother is. There's more to it than that. There's a big question that is looming after the events of this chapter. God has punished David. Even though God has shown him mercy, even though God has not struck David dead, what is God going to do with David? Is God going to abandon David? Is God going to throw David to the side? Is God going to break the promise of making David's house great and continuing things through his line? There's a lot of questions here because David has done an awful thing to God, and maybe God isn't going to put up with him anymore. And you might be justified in thinking about that because that's kind of what happened with with Saul. That initially things were going to go through Saul and his line and his house, and then that gets taken from him. So maybe God will do the same here. Jeff?
Well, when God forgives sin, he doesn't, go back and say, well, David, you did this years ago. So God forgives sin.
Right. And we know that, and that's a very important thing for us to know. This is a good example of illustrating that for us, that a covenant can still be maintained even after that forgiveness of sin. A lot of times in life, in our relationships with each other, when an awful thing like that has happened, and maybe even still we patch things up and we make things right, things are still rocky, that it never really goes back to the way that it was. And with God, he really does forgive. Even though there were consequences, even though that son still died, God is not going to hold it against David forever and use it as an excuse to reduce the blessings that will be given to David or to break the promise that he made in blessing his house going forward. So, yes, we see the birth of Solomon, and that's an important note. But also we see that God loved Solomon, that God has a specific loyalty to Solomon, and this is the man of God's choosing who will inherit the throne and who this will flow through. David's got a bunch of sons by this point, but the next king will be Solomon, and the implication here is because God has chosen Solomon. It won't be Amnon because he's the firstborn. You would think maybe it will be him. It won't be Absalom, even though he tries to take it by force. It will be Solomon. Right? Yeah.
It's important to also remember that God is building the lineage because of right.
Yes. Right. Don't forget about that. That this is not just about who will lead Israel for another generation. Because we think of things, one or two generations at a time, but God is seeing things going forward as well, and God is keeping his promise for the nation for many generations going forward, but this is still bigger than just Israel, that he's building a lineage for Christ to come from as well, and that's going to come through Solomon. It's not just an accident what family Jesus is born into. This is all done very deliberately by God. So what is, so Nathan the prophet goes and tells David that that God loves Solomon and has this loyalty to him. What is this name Jedediah that David gives to Solomon? Gary? Beloved of the Lord. Yeah, that's what my footnote says. I'm going to assume that's right. So, beloved of the Lord. And again, they attach great importance to these names. And so his name is still Solomon. It's not a changing of a name. It's adding another name there. And he's still going to be referred to as Solomon throughout this account. But one of the names that he has is Jedediah, which means beloved of the Lord. And they viewed these names as important things, as reflections of who you were and the hopes for you as well. And so naming this child beloved of the Lord is reflecting this loyalty God has toward him, this love God has toward him, and also I think the hope of how Solomon is going to conduct himself as he grows up and as he leads the nation when it's his turn. Yeah, Mark.
It really does describe it because Solomon, he makes alliances with everybody, good or bad.
Yeah.
But it is very important to see the meetings of the always looking for
Yeah.
peace.
And Solomon's reign is going to be very different than David's. Yeah, that's good for us to note here, that David's at war with all these different nations. He's constantly at war. Solomon will have a reign of peace, and he makes a lot of alliances, And the advancement that Solomon makes for the nation is really an economic advancement, and taking more control of land, not by force, but by economic influence. And that's valuable in a different way. Jeff? Oh, yeah. Yeah. Chapter 13 is going to be whiplash for anyone thinking that the firstborn son of David is a good candidate to be the next king. Yes, Solomon has his problems. He will not be perfect in everything that he does, for sure. But Amnon, Absalom, these others are pretty rough. There's a lot of problems, for sure. Yeah, speaking about those problems, Lauren was reading the kind of an illustrated children's Bible to Nathan, and talking about Solomon, and talking about how God gave wisdom to Solomon, because that's what Solomon asked for. And then the next lesson was talking about how Solomon had, and I believe the way they worded it was 700 princesses. We'll go with princesses, sure. 700 princesses. And Nathan said, "Why did he have so many? I thought he was supposed to be wise." Which I got a good kick out of. Yeah, Solomon, that's a part of a story that we're going to have to explore, that Solomon is given great wisdom but doesn't always use that wisdom, which should be sobering for us. Okay, Steve? Sure, and most of Proverbs being written by Solomon does lend some credence to the wisdom that he had, and possibly Ecclesiastes too, depending on your opinion on that. But yeah, Solomon was not all bad. He had some big missteps for sure, but also did have a lot of wisdom and showed a lot of wisdom and was a good king in general. Gary? Yeah. Which tells me that the sin and righteousness is not just about the knowledge that we have. It's not just about the things that we know and even the experience that we have. It's also about the self-control, about bringing ourselves into subjection. It's about the choices we make. You can know all the right things to do and still not do them. Okay, the way this chapter ends is by bringing us back to how this all got started, and maybe you've forgotten by now. I've just about forgotten, because it almost seems randomly in verse 26 that we're talking about a war with the Ammonites, and then we go, oh yeah, that is how this started. It all began with a war against the Ammonites, and David wasn't in that war. David was not out there fighting with his men. Well, this all does get tied up in a bit of a organized fashion, in that the war comes to an end and they are successful. That Joab, even with the difficulty that David had inserted into the war by kind of commanding a premature assault and the loss of some of the valiant men, that Joab still has gotten the upper hand. They're ready to take over Rabbah. And Joab calls David to come and join and say, we're ready for the final assault. Let's go and attack them. And they do. They're successful. They take great spoils. David gets the crown of their king, and it's placed upon David's head. And the Ammonites are then put under subjection, working hard labor for the Israelites going forward. We didn't get to chapter 13 at all, but I probably should have done better. That's okay. Chapter 13 will be next week then. Amnon and Tamar. It's an unsavory chapter. We're not going to overly dwell on the details of it. I'm aware that it's not a whole lot of fun to read and to talk about. It's a little bit like that Judges 19. I don't like it any more than the rest of you do. But it is part of a narrative that we do need to understand. So, next week. Thanks.